He last time Eddard Stark saw the sky above King's Landing. It was a thin strip of blue caged by stone and iron. The words Varys spoke soft, practical, poisonous coiled in his mind as the eunuch's torch drifted away. Take the black, live. Save your daughters. Ned had already chosen. What Varys did not say, and what Ned alone decided upon as he shivered in the black cell, was this: living was not the same as yielding. Oaths could be weapons as well as bonds. The wall was a place of exile, yes, but it was also a watchtower, and from a watchtower. You could see the storm coming long before it struck the plains. It was still dark when they brought him up disguised, gaunt and hooded, to the cart bound for the king's. A ragged brother of the Night's Watch rode beside him, a paper-thin writ naming the traitor turned penitent who had chosen the wall over the sword. Ned kept his eyes down and his mouth shut. He did not pray for mercy, he prayed for time. Somewhere, far north of the city's stench, Varys' arrangements began to fray in ways Ned had quietly hoped they would. At a crossroads, in where the road forked toward Maidenpool and the Riverlands, the driver of the watch cart found a skin of wine that was not there the night before, and slept deeper than he'd meant to. The recruit with Ned's writ wandered, off to piss, and never returned. When the sun crept over the trees, a fisherman's daughter in a plain hood found a gaunt man standing alone, black cloak folded over his arm. They spoke no words. She led him down the back path to a skiff and set him upon the quiet water. By noon the King's Road had lost him, when at last he climbed ashore in the reeds of the Mander. Ned Stark saw White Harbour's pale walls and felt the biting kind of hope a wounded man resents. He had told the world he would take the black. He would keep the letter of that oath in a way that would scandalize the gentle and please the stubborn. He would go to the watch when he could do the most good. First, he would mend what could still be mended. Wyman Manderley did not gasp when he saw the ghost of the North swagger in on a fisherman's daughter's arm. He only closed the shutters and sent the girl away with enough silver to buy 10 skiffs. "My lord," the fat man said softly, "you are dead." "Not yet," Ned replied. "And if I am to die, let it be in the north, on my feet." Messages flew that night like startled birds. One rode the Dreadfort Road and never arrived. One took the long way to the Neck, where crannogmen with mud-streaked faces read the seal and smiled. One, most important, sped west to the twins, Robb Starks. War had been born in grief, but fed by talent. He moved like a river, cutting its bed deeper, with every bend fewer words than his father, more teeth than his grandfather, and a tenderness he tried to hide from everyone but Greywind. At the twins, the river narrowed to a petty lord with too many noses and not enough dignity. In another turning of the wheel, Robb would have scorned Walder Frey, and a chord of doomed romance would have plucked him south of wisdom. In this turning, a raven came to him at dusk, sealed with a dove in grey wax and a fish in blue. The message inside was short, written in Catelyn's careful hand, but the heart of it was a sentence only she and her husband could have shaped. Keep the old oaths first, and make new ones with an eye to Winter Dot. The old oaths were guest right, and Robb honoured them. The new ones were marriage pacts, and Robb honoured those too. He clasped Lord Walder's hands in the hall that smelled of onions and damp, and when Rosalind Freyshai kindly curtsied to the young wolf, he managed a smile that was not a lie. The phrase cheered grudgingly at first, then loudly as bread and salt and wine sealed what swords could not dot in Winterfell. The fires burned lower than they had in living memory. Bran, the boy in the broken tower, listened to the wind and heard its foreign words. Osha kept him warm with stories that were meant to scare and comfort both at once. The dead walk in the white quiet, she murmured one night as the window whistled. The wood remembers. Master Lewin frowned and flipped pages in old books, teaching sums to a boy who dreamed of wolves and trees whose faces opened like wounds. Then Theon came home with iron in his eyes, but this was not the same Theon who swaggered after smiles in a warm hall. He had spent too many nights staring from the rails of a Greyjoy ship at a coastline he'd once called his, and he had woken too many mornings smelling salt and regret. His father spoke to him in the old tongue of the islands, scorn and command braided into one rope. The rope burned Theon's hands. When he reached Winterfell's gate, he hesitated long enough for a boy on the battlements to recognize a beloved brother returning rather than a raider come to sneer. Bran shouted his name. Theon laughed, and the laugh caught. "I've brought news," he said, and Lewin saw the tremor. "Not war, not yet." The news spread from White Harbor to Moat Cailin to the Twins and back again. The North had a secret. Heartbeat, Catelyn knew the rhythm. She read Ned's second message, the one Wyman kept in a hidden drawer, and wept without noise. "Alive," she whispered to Robb in the candlelight. "But you must not seek him. Every step south is a net." Robb clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He wanted the world to be simple. March, fight, win, bring his sisters home. He wanted to be the son who could fix what had broken. Instead, he was a king who must choose which fractures would do the least harm. So he chose differently than the songs some bard would have preferred. He sent emissaries not only to the Riverlands, but to Dragonstone. Stannis Baratheon was iron wrapped around embers. He would have made a poor friend, but better a poor friend than a certain enemy. Robb's letter, drafted by Catelyn and signed with a direwolf, did not bend the knee. It acknowledged a truth only Ned had insisted upon when councils ran hot. The realm could not be saved by a dozen crowns, each jealously tall. It could only be held together by an agreement to look at the real danger. That danger stalked far from the halls of lords. Jeor Mormont stood on the wall and watched the emptiness move like a bruise across the forest. His ravens were tired, his men were thin. When a black-cloaked figure reached Eastwatch by sea under cover of a snow-salted dawn, the old bear came to the yard himself. He stared at the man whose face was carved into northern songs and opened his mouth to curse, then shut it again. "You took the black Jeor," said at last, "but you didn't come by the road." "I came by need," Ned answered, "and by debt." "Let me pay both," Jeor snorted. "You have sons to care for and girls to save." "I have a realm to warn," Ned said, and when he explained what he had seen in Robert's court, gold poured like water into blades, turned inward, a red queen whispering fears, a boy king who did not understand that winter was not a metaphor. The old bear's grim amusement softened to reluctant respect. "Write your letters," Jeor grumbled. "But when you're done, you're mine. Steel and boots and the simple truth. That's the currency north of here." The letters flew again, stamped with black wax and a different kind of urgency. One went to Robb and never reached him, taken by riders whose banners hid their true colors. Another reached Wyman, who smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes and ordered 3 new ships' keels laid in secret. A third went to the Eyrie, where a nervous woman with a bird's bones clutched her boy and told herself stories of safety. Somewhere under it all, needle-thin and relentless, the cold moved when father and son finally spoke. It was through words that crossed forests and fens in the hands of men who would die nameless. Robb wrote, in a hand gone steadier since the whispering wood, "I can hold the neck, I can keep the phrase for now. If I go south, I bleed twice, once to the lions and once to the songs that want me glorious. Tell me where I must be ugly instead." Reply was spare. "Be ugly where the dead will come. The rest is vanity. Bind the river to the wolf and the wolf to the reed. Trust the Manderley ships and the Crannig's secrets. Do not trust the flayed man in the Dreadfort." A man smiled privately, as if he had heard a joke from a god he did not believe in. He had made different arrangements for a different song. In the Twins, a wedding feast was planned with fewer knives hidden beneath the table and more food above it. In White Harbor, a girl who had ferried a ghost counted her silver and watched the horizon for a ship that never came. By the time the first true winter wind stood up and looked south, the north was a riddle with its answer buried in snow. A living lord called dead, a boy king who would not be made a fool again. Ships being built at night, and a black-cloaked oathbreaker keep his oath, who sharpened a sword that had once rested above a hearth in Winterfell. The game was not gentler for their survival. It was sharper, colder, and far more honest. Snow sifted down like salt over Eastwatch as Ned Stark stood on the wall's eastern edge, watching the grey waves heave under the wind. He felt the stones breathe cold into his bones and wondered if the sea itself would freeze before the war truly came. The old bears, black-cloaked men, had given him a place in the keep's upper room, not as a lord, not as a prisoner, but as something stranger. He was both a guest and a warning. Every night he thought of the south of Arya, half wild and likely in trouble, of Sansa, polished into a shape she was never meant to be, of Catelyn, whose courage he trusted more than any knight's sword. The news that reached the wall came slow and crooked, but it was enough to show him the south was still bleeding. King Joffrey sat the Iron Throne with a hand too young for the sword he carried. Cersei's whispers ran through the Red Keep like rot through a beam. And in the east, the name Daenerys Targaryen had begun to appear in sailors' tales always, with dragons on her shoulder. If he could have ridden south in that moment, he might have, but the ravens were faster than any man, and Gior had been right. His duty now was to warn, not to wander at the same time. Robb Stark was no longer the boy who had left Winter. The young wolf was growing into a king, and kings had to do more than win battles. They had to weave the cloth that would last after the blood dried. His marriage to Rosalind Frey had been sealed before the sept, with Walder's crooked grin in the background and half the Riverlands watching. Robb had been ready for bitterness, ready for grudges and for Frey treachery. Instead, he found a girl whose gentle wit reminded him faintly of his mother. It made keeping his oaths easier. Yet every time the map was unrolled before him, his eyes drifted north to the neck, to Moat Cailin, to the wall. He heard the words his mother had read to him from his father's letter. Bind the river to the wolf and the wolf to the reed. The river was already tied to him by blood and by war. The reed's house, Reed were another matter. Robb summoned Mage Mormont to his tent and sent her with a small escort into the swamps, bearing gifts and his personal plea for Howland Reed's counsel. Few in the realm remembered Howland's face. Fewer still could find Greywater Watch. Robb was counting on that. Meanwhile, in Winterfell, the quiet before the storm was thinner than ice over running water. Bran dreamed almost nightly of a great weirwood tree whose red eyes opened wider the closer he walked. Sometimes the dream carried him further, into the bodies of wolves padding silently through snow. Osha warned him not to speak of it to the maester, but Hodor, gentle as the sun in summer, kept the boy's secret. Theon Greyjoy lingered in those days, half in his father's shadow and half in the light of the Stark's hearth. He carried himself like a man unsure which name would save him, Greyjoy or Stark. In White Harbor, Wyman Manderly's shipwrights worked under the cover of night, their hammers muffled, their keels hidden beneath sheds. Rumors said they were merchant, cogs for Manderly trade. In truth, they were heavier, broader built for carrying soldiers and supplies. Wyman had no intention of sending them south yet. He was waiting for the right letter, the right signal, far from any harbor, in the forests. Beyond the wall, rangers rode through drifts deeper than a man's thigh. When they returned, they brought more than frostbite. They brought fear. "The villagers are gone," one said to Ned as they warmed their hands. "Not burned, not abandoned, gone like they never were." Another swore he'd seen shapes moving between the trees, pale and quick, vanishing whenever steel was drawn. That night, Ned wrote to Robb again, this time with more urgency. "The true enemy will not wait for our quarrels to end. The wall is not enough. When the dead come, they will not march by road or river, they will come with the storm itself." By the time that letter crossed the neck, Robb had already made another gamble. He sent word to Stannis Baratheon, offering to treat in the open fields of the Riverlands under truce. His lords grumbled Stannis was a hard man, not an ally to be trusted, but Robb had learned from his father's stories that a hard man who shares your enemy is worth more than a smiling man who does not. On Dragonstone, Stannis read the Raven's scroll twice. "A boy," he said to Davos Seaworth, "but a boy who keeps his oaths. That is more than I can say for the rest." Davos, ever the cautious one, asked, "And will you meet him?" Stannis looked to the painted table where the realm sprawled, like a wounded beast. "Aye, but I will not come alone." Far to the east, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen stepped into the streets of Qarth with dragons coiled on her shoulders. She had never heard the name Robb Stark. She had heard the name Ned Stark once, in a wine-soaked tale told by a Pentoshi trader, something about a man who would not bow. She thought no more of it. But in the years to come, the girl with dragons would learn that in Westeros, the names you do not yet know are the ones that matter most. And in the Dreadfort, Ramsay Snow fed his hounds. He had received no letters, no summons, but he smiled all the same. Winter was coming, and winter was his favorite season. The first meeting between Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon was not a thing of pomp or banners. They chose a meadow between two nameless Riverlands villages that had been burned months ago. Only a few stumps and the charred skeleton of a windmill stood against the winter sky. Both sides came with small retinues, no more than a dozen men each, the kind of meeting where everyone's hands rested a little too close to their sword hilts. Robb dismounted first. Stannis did not. For a long moment they stared at each other, Volf and Stag, youth and flint. When Stannis finally spoke, it was with that iron-flat voice of his. "Your father served my brother loyally. I cannot say the same for the rest of the realm." Robb inclined his head just enough to show respect without surrender. "My father's counsel was never taken in full. Perhaps if it had been, we wouldn't be standing in a graveyard." The talk that followed was tense, circling like wary dogs. Robb offered no crown and asked for none in return only. That's acknowledged the North's right to guard itself without interference from the Iron Throne. In exchange, The North would not march on the Crown lands so long as the true war Stannis' war was against the Lannisters. Stannis, ever rigid, asked for something more, the ships of White Harbour to aid his own scant fleet. Robb agreed, but only after Stannis swore in the sight of the Seven and the old gods that the North would never again be forced to kneel while a foreign enemy threatened their shores. When they parted, neither man called the other friend, but they left without blood spilled. That was as good as an alliance could be in the game they played. Meanwhile, in White Harbour, Wyman Manderley finally received the letter he had been waiting for. The seal was black, the wax stamped with the direwolf of House Stark, but the hand was unmistakably Eddard's. It contained only a few lines, but they were enough. The wall cannot hold alone. Build for the sea. Build for the storm. Manderley doubled the night shifts in his shipyards and began quietly gathering provisions that would last not weeks, but months at sea. In Winterfell, Bran's dreams grew sharper. The great weirwood tree spoke without moving. Its carved lips, and when he woke, he could still feel snowflakes melting on his skin, though the hearth burned warm. One night, the dream carried him far north, further than the wall where he saw his father, cloaked in black, standing beside the old bear on a tower of ice. He woke crying and would not tell Maester Luwin why. Osha only nodded when Bran whispered it to her. "Your blood knows its own, boy," she said. Theon, for his part, found himself caught in two worlds he did not fully belong to. Letters from Pike grew sharper in tone, each one reminding him of Balon's disdain for northern ways. Yet Theon had also begun to hear the quiet creak of a noose tightening in the Iron Islands. The sea-stone chair was not so secure as his father claimed, and Theon's loyalty was a coin both sides wanted to buy. Far beyond these human intrigues, the Wall's rangers brought darker news still. They spoke of wildling villages swallowed by silence, of shadows moving against the snow without the weight of bodies. Ned listened, jaw set, and thought of Robert's court, how all the games and treacheries had blinded them to what was real. He wrote again to Robb, urging him to send men north, not for conquest, but for survival. That letter was intercepted before it reached the twins. The riders who took it bore Bolton colours, but they carried no message back to their lord. Instead, they burned the parchment to ash. Some secrets were worth more dead than delivered. In King's Landing, the Lannisters grew bolder. Cersei, convinced the North had been broken beyond repair, turned her attention to Stannis and Renly's lingering shadows. She allowed herself to believe the war was shrinking, not knowing that both her enemies and her deadliest threat were gathering strength far from the city's walls and across the sea. Daenerys Targaryen finally heard the name Stark again, not in a drunken sailor's tale, but from a Carthene merchant who claimed the North was in rebellion. She laughed at the idea that anyone would dare such a thing while the Lannisters ruled, but part of her wondered Westeros, it seemed, was full of wolves. At Eastwatch, Ned stood on the wall with the old bear, watching the pale blue shimmer of the aurora dance beyond the Frostfangs. "Winter comes faster than they believe," Gior said. "They won't believe until it's at their door," Ned replied, "and then it will be too late." Snow had begun to fall in thick, wet clumps over the riverlands, the kind that turned roads into mud and slowed armies to a crawl. Robb Stark used the delay to his advantage, sending small, swift riders to strengthen his ties with the river lords and keep the Freys under constant watch. Though Roslyn's gentle presence made his marriage bearable, Walder Frey was still Walder. Freyan, old man with grudges as sharp as his nose, who saw every alliance as a transaction and every favor as a debt. Robb made certain to pay him in courtesy, feasts, and visible respect, knowing that an insult to Walder could undo more than a year's worth of planning. Mage Mormont returned from the Neck with a message from Howland. Read. The Cranaglord had written little, but each word carried weight. The swamps are ready. The river bends to the wharf. The reeds will rise when the frost cracks. Robb read it twice and felt, for the first time since leaving Winterfell, a sliver of confidence that the North might hold together through the coming storm. In Winterfell, Bran began noticing changes in himself. Sometimes, when he dreamed of wolves, he woke to find Summer pacing the Godswood, restless and alert. Once, he saw through Summer's eyes the distant glimmer of torches moving in the snow far beyond the castle walls. Osha warned him again to keep such visions quiet. The gods give gifts for reasons, and men take them for themselves if they can, she said. Maester Luwin, though, saw the boy's distracted gaze and suspected something he could not name. Theon grew more unsettled by the day. He had written to Balon Greyjoy twice, offering plans for raids along the Westerlands coast to harry Lannister trade routes, but received no reply. He could feel his father's disapproval like a cold wind on the back of his neck. Yet leaving Winterfell now felt like abandoning something more than stone walls, felt like betraying the only family that had ever treated him as more than a pawn. At White Harbour, Wyman Manderley's shipyards were producing their first completed vessels under tarpaulins. The broad-bellied ships looked like sleeping sea beasts. Manderley had begun quietly recruiting sailors and marines, many of them loyal only to the Manderley name but bound to House Stark by long-standing fealty. His son Wylus kept the records locked in a chest with 3 keys, one for himself, one for his father, and one to be sent, when the time was right, to Robb. In King's Landing. Sansa Stark played the role of the dutiful lady with increasing skill, though inside her heart was raw. She had learned to smile when Joffrey demanded it, and to keep her voice steady when Cersei's questions pressed too close. Seir Dantos hollered, half drunk most days, had whispered to her of an escape that might come when the moon is right. She dared not believe him fully, but she tucked the thought away like a secret seed. Ned's presence at the wall was beginning to ripple beyond Eastwatch. Gior Mormont had brought him into private councils, treating him not as a guest, but as a brother of the Watch with a lord's experience. Some of the younger brothers regarded Ned with awe, others with suspicion, but none could deny that his knowledge of southern politics was as sharp as his sword arm. When news came that Mance Rayder was gathering the free folk in numbers not seen for generations, Ned was one of the first to argue for a strong, coordinated defense, not just to guard against wildlings, but for what might be driving them south. That night, Ned wrote a longer letter to Robb than any before. If Mance Rayder is fleeing rather than attacking, it means there is something behind him that even the king beyond the wall will not face. Send word to your bannermen, ready the Neck, and keep your ships in harbour until I say otherwise when they are needed. You will know. But again, the letter never reached Robb. Intercepted in the cold marshes south of Moat Cailin, it was read by men loyal to Roose Bolton. This time, the message was not destroyed. It was carried straight to the Dreadfort. Ramsay Snow read it with the slow, deliberate care of a man savouring a meal. He folded it once, tucked it into his sleeve, and began to make his own plans. Far across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen left Karth behind. Her dragons had grown enough to stretch their wings in brief, wheeling flights. She thought often of Westeros now, not just as a dream, but as a place to reclaim. and though she did not yet know it, her path and the North's were inching toward each other, drawn together by storms neither could see. At the wall, the cold deepened. The wind seemed to whisper in voices just beyond the edge of hearing. One night, Ned dreamed of Winterfell not in ruin, but wreathed in snow, with the sound of a wolf howling somewhere beyond the gates. When he woke, Jorah Mormont was already at his door. "We ride at first light," the old bear said grimly. "There's something in the woods we need to see for ourselves." The ride from Eastwatch into the haunted forest was slower than Ned expected. Snow had crusted over the ground in sharp layers, and the rangers' horses picked their way carefully among roots and frozen streams. Jorah Mormont led the column, silent as a carved figurehead, his raven hopping restlessly on his shoulder. Ned rode behind him, cloak pulled tight, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. They found the village by the smell before they saw it. It was not the stench of battle, no rot of men or beasts, but something colder, emptier. Houses stood whole, doors swinging loose on leather hinges, meals half-eaten on tables, a child's carved toy dropped in the snow. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, only absence. One of the younger brothers muttered, "They didn't leave, they were taken." Jorah silenced him with a glare, but the words hung in the air like frost. In the largest house, Ned found a weirwood carving half buried in the ashes of a hearth. The face was smooth, the eyes closed as if in sleep. He felt an urge to touch it but did not. Instead, he turned to Jorah. Whatever happened here, it was no ordinary raid. The old bear nodded grimly. "Aye, and it's moving south." Back in the Riverlands, Robb received word from Mage Mormont that the Crannogman had begun fortifying the neck in earnest pits dug. Causeways flooded, deadfalls set in the trees. No army would pass through easily, but Robb's mind was increasingly fixed on something else. The Lannisters had grown quiet. Tywin was holding the Westerlands, sending out smaller forces instead of marching his main host. Catelyn suspected this meant he was consolidating power, waiting for an opportunity. Robb decided not to give him one. He kept his forces mobile, striking only when supplies or enemy morale were vulnerable. The marriage alliance with the Freys allowed him to move through the twins freely now, though he never stayed longer than a night. Walder Frey, for all his smiles, was not a man Robb wished to leave at his back for long. In Winterfell, Bran's strange connection to summer deepened. One night, through the wolf's eyes, he saw movement beyond the southern tree line, a group of armed men dragging sledges heavy with supplies. When Bran woke, he described the scene to Osha, who went pale. "Those are no traders," she said. "Those are reiters, and they'll not come here for trade." Theon heard of it next, and, to everyone's surprise, insisted on leading a small party to intercept them. It was a hard, fast march, but they caught the raiders at a narrow ford and drove them off. When Theon returned, snow in his beard and a fresh cut across his arm, Bran greeted him with something like pride. For the first time in months, Theon felt like a Stark again at White Harbor. The first of Manderly's ships quietly set sail under the guise of merchant voyagers. Their true purpose was to map the northern coastline for potential landings and resupply points. Should war something worse drive the fight to the shore, the crews were sworn to silence under pain of exile. In King's Landing, Sansa noticed a change in Joffrey. He seemed more restless, quicker to anger, and occasionally glanced northward during council sessions as if imagining some far-off enemy. Cersei's whispers to him had grown sharper, her hand tightening around the Boy King's reins. Littlefinger, meanwhile, smiled more than usual, a sure sign, Sansa thought, that he was working some scheme. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys reached Astapor and saw the Unsullied for the first time. The discipline of these soldiers stirred something in her, a vision of an army that could carry her to Westeros. When she dreamed that night, she saw not the Red Keep, but a snow-covered fortress and a direwolf's shadow on the battlements. She woke unsettled, the image lingering like smoke. Back at the wall, Ned and Jor returned to Eastwatch with heavier hearts. The absence they'd found in the forest was worse than death. It was a sign of an enemy that left nothing behind. Jor called a full council of his officers and placed Ned beside him. "The time for warning letters is over," Jor said to the room. "If the South won't listen, then the North must prepare alone, and will hold until they learn the truth for themselves." Ned didn't disagree, but he knew the South would only believe when it was too late. In the Dreadford, Ramsay Snow spread Ned's intercepted letter across his table again. This time he read it aloud to Reek, smiling as though savoring a secret. "The wolf thinks he can guard against the storm," he said softly. "Let's see how well he fares when the storm comes from behind." The wind howled against the wall the night Ned Stark decided to ride for Castle Black. Eastwatch was secure enough for now, but the old bear had insisted the heart of the watch needed to hear his words in person. It was a 3-day journey along. The top of the wall, the pale expanse of the haunted forest to his left, and the ghost-grey sea to his right. Ned rode in silence, thinking of how easily the realm below had forgotten this cold frontier. When he arrived, the brothers of Castle Black greeted him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some had heard of Lord Stark's execution in King's Landing and couldn't reconcile the man before them with the tale. Jon Snow, however, needed no convincing. He was among the first to greet Ned, and though their embrace was brief, there were eyes everywhere. It was enough to warm a piece of Ned's heart that had been frozen since the black cells in the Great Hall. Ned spoke plainly to the gathered officers. The true enemy is not across the narrow sea, nor in the Iron Throne's court. It is here, and it is moving. Some scoffed, but others, men who had seen blue-eyed shadows in the snow, listened. Hard Jor Mormont backed every word. "We need ravens to every corner of the realm," Jor said, "but we'll not wait for their answer before we act." Meanwhile, in the Riverlands, Robb received tidings from Stannis. The Baratheon king had struck a blow against the Lannister supply lines, forcing Tywin to divert men westward. It gave Robb breathing room, but also left him with a choice: press the advantage and strike deep, or pull back to consolidate his own defenses. Catelyn counseled caution. "Every step south takes you further from the neck," she warned, "and the neck is your lifeline." Robb listened and stayed. In Winterfell, Bran's wolf dreams grew bolder. He began to see not just Summer's view, but flashes of the wall, of the forest beyond it, and even of strange cities he did not know. He told Osha of one dream in which a great white shape moved through the snow, its eyes like cold suns. She said nothing, but her hand tightened on her spear. Theon, emboldened by his success against the raiders, started drilling some of Winterfell's garrison in skirmish tactics he'd learned on the Iron Islands. The men respected him more now, though some still muttered Greyjoy under their breath. Theon ignored it. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something rather than just surviving. At White Harbor, Wyman Manderley dispatched his first warship northward, under the cover of trade. Its mission was to scout the waters around Skagoza, wild island long untouched by most of the realm. Rumors said its people were fierce and half feral, but Wyman believed they might be swayed to the Stark cause. Skagos could be a bastion if the seas became a battlefield. In King's Landing, Sansa overheard a conversation between Varys and Littlefinger, while hiding in the shadows of the Red Keep's gallery. The words were vague, but she caught enough. Talk of the Wolf King's restraint and a shadow gathering in the frost. She didn't know what it meant, but it sounded like they were watching her brother far more closely than anyone. Admitted, across the narrow sea, Daenerys's dragons had doubled in size. She bartered 4 ships in Astapor, but found the prices steep and the sellers untrustworthy. Her thoughts turned more often to Westeros not as a single conquest, but as a land of many kingdoms, each with its own will. If I am to take it, she told Ser Jorah, I must know every piece of it, even the frozen ones. Jorah said little, but his eyes narrowed at the thought. Back at Castle Black, Ned stood with Jon atop the wall one night. The day will come when you must choose between your vows and your blood, Ned told him. When it does, remember oaths are not chains, they are swords. You must wield them. Jon looked at him strangely, as if sensing more in the words than was said. And what of you, which do you wield? Ned's eyes were on the forest. Both, he said simply. Far away in the Dreadfort, Ramsay Snow had begun to move pieces. On his own board, small bands of his men, disguised as outlaws, roamed the countryside near the neck, not to fight but to vanish, leaving whispers of danger behind. Ramsay didn't need armies to unsettle the north-only shadows. The first snowstorm of the true winter hit the north hard. It swept across the wall like a white curtain, blinding rangers and silencing the forest. At Castle Black, Ned stood with Jeor Mormont in the yard as the wind howled between the towers. It's not the storm, I fear, the old bear said, his beard crusted with ice. It's what walks behind it. The rangers who had ventured out before the storm returned 2 days late, frostbitten and gaunt-eyed. They spoke of finding a hunting party of wildlings, frozen where they stood. Weapons raised, their bodies unbroken, but their faces twisted in terror. No tracks led to or from the place, only the snow, disturbed in strange circular patterns as if something had moved beneath it. Ned wasted no time. He sent 2 ravens, one to Robb, warning him to keep his armies mobile in the north, and another to Wyman Manderley with a single line, ready the ships for war, not trade. In the Riverlands, Robb received his father's message. This time it had slipped past the nets of the Boltons. He read it in silence, then summoned his commanders. We're pulling back toward the neck, he announced. If the storm comes, we'll meet it on ground we choose. The Frey banners stirred uneasily at the news. Walder's sons muttering about retreat and loss of face, but Robb met their complaints with the cold steel of his crown's authority. At Winterfell, Bran felt the change before the news arrived. In his dreams, summer prowled under an endless white sky, every scent on the wind carrying the same warning. Danger, he told Osha, who nodded grimly and began stockpiling food in secret caches around the castle. Theon noticed her work and offered to help, his loyalty to Winterfell, now rooted in more than just politics. In White Harbor, Manderley's ship from Skagos returned with unexpected news. The islanders, wary but curious, had agreed to send envoys to treat with the North. More astonishing still, they had warriors who knew the old waysmen, who claimed their ancestors had fought the dead before, and who swore they could do so again. Wyman sent word to Robb immediately, knowing time was short. King's Landing buzzed with whispers of Robb Stark's withdrawal northward. Cersei interpreted it as weakness and pressed Joffrey to push an offensive through the Riverlands, but Tywin refused. The wolf retreats, not because he is beaten, Tywin said in council, but because he hunts a different prey. Let him. The north will freeze, and we will hold the south. Varys said nothing, though the faintest smile played on his lips. Across the narrow sea Daenerys had taken the Unsullied. As she led them from Astapor, she dreamed again of the snow-covered fortress and the shadow of a direwolf. This time, the dream ended with the sound of distant howling that grew louder until she woke, heart racing. She told no one. At Castle Black, Jon Snow returned from arranging north of the Wall with more troubling news. He had seen the first signs of the others' glimpses in the trees, blue glints in the night. Ned listened in silence, then told Jon the truth of the empty villages he had seen himself. Together, they went to the Old Bear. "We cannot face them alone," Ned said. "If the north falls, the realm falls with it." Gior looked between the two of them, his expression grim. "Then we hold until the south believes. And when they do, they'll pray it's not too late." In the Dreadfort, Ramsay's traps were beginning to bear fruit. Refugees fleeing south from the storms brought tales of shadow armies in the forests. None knew the truth that half those shadows were Bolton men stirring fear for their own gain. Ramsay planned to turn panic into opportunity. By month's end, the first signs of the dead moving south reached the Neck. Howland Reed's messengers slipped through the marshes to Robb's camp, their news carrying the weight of a hammer blow. The storm was no longer a rumor. It was a march. The first true battle of the long night in the living memory of men began not at the wall, but in the frozen marshes of the Neck. It came with the sound of cracking ice and the flicker of pale shapes, gliding between the reeds. Robb Stark stood on a raised causeway, the wind whipping his cloak, watching as the first rank of his men braced their shields against an enemy they could barely see. Howland Reed's crannogmen fought like ghosts in their own right, vanishing into the bog, striking with poisoned darts and disappearing before the dead could close. The reek of burning pitch filled the air as fire arrows lit the sky, the only light that seemed to make the pale figures falter. But the enemy was relentless, moving in silence, their cold pressing forward like a tide dot in the midst of it. A horn sounded from the western marshes. Wyman Manderley's ships had arrived, their decks bristling with archers and barrels of flaming oil. The vessels could not sail the swamps, but they turned the narrow waterways into killing lanes, hemming the enemy in where fire could reach them at the wall. Ned received the Raven from Howland, too late to join the next offense, but soon enough to act. He ordered every able man to the Frostfang passes, where wildling scouts claimed the dead were massing. Jon rode with him, Ghost at his side, the bond between father and son tempered now not by shared blood, but by the cold truth of what they fought in Winterfell. Bran's dreams became something more. He no longer only saw through summer's eyes, he moved through them, fighting alongside the direwolf in the Neck, sensing the cold hunger of the dead, as if it were a shadow trying to swallow the world. Osha tended him as he slipped in and out of consciousness, muttering words in a tongue older than the old tongue. Theon commanded a detachment guarding Winterfell's southern approach. When a band of Bolton allies arrived, claiming they'd come to reinforce the defenses, Theon stopped them at the gate. Something in their eyes was wrong to eager. Too hungry, he sent word to Bran and had the men disarmed. In their packs he found maps of Winterfell marked with entry points. For the first time, Theon realized the Boltons were not simply waiting for the right side to win. They were waiting for everyone to lose. Far to the south, King's Landing remained deaf to the truth. Cersei dismissed the reports as northern superstition. Tywin read them, said nothing, and quietly began reinforcing the capital's stores. Varys listened to the whispers and wondered if the realm would break in half before it realized the war had changed. Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen's dreams turned colder. She stood in a land of endless snow, her dragons circling overhead, their fire struggling against a darkness that seemed to eat the light. She woke with the taste of ash in her mouth and a decision forming. She would not only take Westeros, she would save it. Back in the neck, the battle raged for 3 days. By the 4th, the dead began to pull back, their retreat as silent as their advance. The living had held but only barely. Reed's marshes were littered with corpses that would have to be burned, day and night, until no trace remained. Robb stood with Howland on a sodden bank, both men mud-smeared and weary. "We won," Robb said, though the word felt hollow. Howland shook his head. "No, we delayed them, and winter is long." When the Raven, carrying news of the next stand, reached the wall, Ned read it by torchlight. Jon stood beside him, face set. "They'll come again," Jon said. "Yes," Ned replied, "and next time, they'll come for all of us." Far inland at the Dreadfort, Ramsay Snow fed scraps to his hounds and listened to the storm batter the walls. "Let the dead take the weak," he murmured, "the rest will be mine." And so the Game of Thrones did not end it twisted. The board was no longer kings and castles alone, but a map where ice crept south and fire gathered east. The wolves still lived, but winter was here, and it had teeth.